How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most in-between podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia from
And
2023.
we're fucking back, baby!
Let's go! New
Worst of
Year.
us are back! New year, new cassette tape! Woo!
Woo!
Hell's
Yee.
fucking... Yeah, it's been way too long since we've actually done one of these. It's been a long time. We had a stream always in between, but like getting the actual podcast stuff done, we haven't actually done much since like November or October or something like that.
Yeah, so I guess you could say that everyone listening has been podcast deprived, but thankfully, Mick, I think we've a pretty good cure for that.
Thank
Thank you.
I see what you did there.
Just leave my PayPal. And,
Yeah.
can
Just
pay me for that.
donate to our Patreon for the top
No,
tier
just
comedy that we have.
I'm a freelance writer. I want money for that one.
Oh, who have you done freelance work for, by the way, huh?
The Cure. The Cure.
Fair enough. The Cure, as the band The Cure. And
Yeah.
speaking of which, today's worst to best is going to be on the one, the only, The Cure. Probably one of the most iconic gothic rock and kind of post-punk bands and new wave bands of the 80s. And I've been very excited to do this one. The Cure are up there as probably one of my favorite bands. And they have a lengthy enough discography, but they have a lot of quality stuff there, especially towards the upper echelon of their work. And yeah, we've been putting this off for months now, but I'm so happy that we're going to be getting to do it now. And yeah, so you ready to get started?
I'm ready.
Yep, just to preface this before we begin, no compilations, live albums, EPs, or any of that shite, just the 13 studio albums. And yeah, with that in mind, let's move on to the unlucky number 13. And for me, The Cure's worst album is Wild Mood Swings.
My number 13 is The Top.
The Top. Okay, so Wild Mood Swings is often seen by many fans of The Cure as a bit of a footnote in the band's discography. It was seen as one of their least well-received records since the album you mentioned, The Top, came out, and as a bit of a failure in The Cure's discography. It's easy to see why that was the case, as Wild Mood Swings does in fact live up to that reputation and that album title as well, actually. And while it's not a bad album, it's easily in the debate for being The Cure's worst album, in my opinion, and for me, it is their worst album. It lives up to the title by means of what the band were trying to do sonically across this album. The album, it's constantly throwing new ideas at the wall and testing the waters, but the problem is none of the ideas really stick the landing or come off as anything that memorable, since a lot of the songs on the album give way to a lot of very unmemorable moments and some very questionable production choices. It's like Robert Smith's amalgamation of ideas were thrown onto this album, from run-of-the-mill like Cure pop songs to a brass section, there's chamber instrumentation, there's songs that give off a more quirky influence, and for the most part, not much of it lands and it's a bit unremarkable. Now, the opening track is definitely great in my opinion, but the rest of it ranges from serviceful to just very uninspired and dull. Not to mention, I think that some of the production choices are a bit dodgy on this album. At points, the strings and the synths just sound so off-puttingly MIDI. A lot of The Cure's post-early material was fairly eclectic, but Wild Mood Swings just feels like a mess more than those other albums that are in this vein, like Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, for example. On top of that, the album just kind of feels like a slog to sit through. I know a bunch of Cure albums are fairly lengthy, with a lot of them being close to or over an hour long, but this one just feels like a drag to sit through, and it begs the question, was there really any need for this record to be the way that it is? I'm not putting down the band's artistry because they've made some amazing music, but this is one instance where it just never really hits, and it's bad when the opening track in the album is where it peaks. So yeah, overall, Wild Mood Swings is a bit of a mess for The Cure. I don't think it's a bad album, but it's for sure a pretty mediocre one, and it's one where The Cure's ideas were really beginning to lose me. The opening track is cool, but not much else of note is really on here, unfortunately.
Yeah, I went with the Top, which I'm gonna say I think it's a bad album. I think it's the only bad album in The Cure's discography. To me, this thing is just so weird. It was released in the middle of what I and I guess almost everyone would call the band's golden era. It was a period in time where it seemed like they were creating more and more impressive material with every consecutive release, and this project just sticks out like a sore thumb. It makes absolutely no sense to me. The band here just tried to unwrite the leaps they made in their dense gothic rock style on their previous album Pornography, and just completely play into the new wave post-punk sound that just dominated the airwaves at that point. And it's a sound that they themselves had just, in my opinion, outgrown, and there was absolutely no need to kind of devolve into whatever The Cure we get on the top, because it's devoid of anything that makes The Cure great. It's just new wave pastiche. It does have some like odd psychedelic quirks, I guess, but very, very seldom are they ever executed gracefully or even interestingly in any way. I think the only real standout track is The Caterpillar. I think that there's something about the psychedelic pop sound of that track that is just kind of irresistibly sweet, but I think that mostly everything else on this album is just drivel. It should never have happened, and the fact that it was released between two absolutely fantastic Cure classics is just a head scratcher to me. It feels like a glitch in the Matrix.
Of course. With that in mind, my favorite track off of Wild Mood Swings is Want. My least favorite track is Club America.
My favorite track is The Caterpillar. My least favorite tracks are Wailing Wall, Give Me It, and The Top.
Alright, moving on to our number 12 picks, and I chose The Cure.
I chose Wild Mood Swings.
Okay then. It's ironic that this album was titled as their self-titled. It couldn't be any less representative of a Cure album than what it actually is, in my opinion. Self-titled saw the band drastically try and shift up their sound a bit, and how they did that was by giving themselves a slightly heavier and angrier edge to their sound while maintaining the darkness of some of their more dark albums. But the way that it was done was mainly because of one man, and that man being producer Ross Robinson, who is actually more well known for producing and being behind some of the biggest heavy hitters of the nu metal genre. He's done production for Deftones, Korn, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot, you name it. He heavily influenced what the band were doing on this album for sure, and while it's great to see bands branch out and try new things, I don't think how self-titled turned out was really something that suited a band like The Cure. Generally, I can't really slate the album as a whole in terms of production, mixing, and all that, because they aren't really bogged down too much for me in that aspect. And I actually think The Cure experimenting with heavier and more sour tones is pretty interesting. But when it comes to the actual songs, I can't really get into them because they just aren't really that interesting or memorable as a whole. There's only one song in this album that I dislike, and that's Us or Them, which is just so fucking overly edgy and over the top. I just can never finish that song. Ugh. As for the rest, I just don't think it's that interesting, and at points I suppose Robert Smith's more shout-driven delivery just doesn't do much for me either. To give credit to Robert Smith vocally though, being able to sound like that in your 40s is pretty impressive, so that's a bonus. As for the other parts, I just don't really think there's much worthwhile about them. It's just fine for the most part. I appreciate the experimentation, of course, but I just don't think the album is even that interesting to take note of, as a lot of the songs just fail to stick out and just become a bit boring, I think. I couldn't even tell what most of these tracks sound like, apart from Us or Them, because Us or Them fucking sucks. So, yeah, that's it. I don't know, I have nothing else to say about the self-titled.
I went with your least favorite Cure album, Wild Mood Swings, and I don't hate this album, but it's also just not very good. And I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that alternative rock in The Cure is a combination which fielded some absolutely great moments that we will be talking about soon. But by 1996, I think maybe the well had just run dry, because this thing, a lot of the time, is a little drab. I'll start with one glaring positive. I think the opening track, Want, is a fucking masterpiece. The guitar work is sick, the production is perfectly impactful, and Robert Smith's vocal performance is just drenched in such pained emotion. But things do kind of drive off a cliff immediately after that. After two listens, not just in the background, like present listens, I cannot recall a single track other than the first one, like, right off the bat. It just all kind of fades into one another. Nothing really stands out. It just kind of all sounds like a shell of the Cure we get on albums like Wish or Head on a Door. And in fact, after re-listening again, I think the only other real standout track is the 13th. And let me just say this. It's not for any good reason. I think it's an absolute mistake. It should never have happened. So yeah, technically there are 2 standout tracks, so I'll give it that. Yeah, there's no reason to recommend this album to anyone except if they're, looking to listen to all of the Cure's discography. But it kind of exists. That's all I can say about it.
It in fact exists. All right, that's one way to put it. I do agree though. Fucking what's the name of the track? Want is pretty great. I won't even lie. Yeah, with that in mind, my favorite track off of self-titled, well, quote unquote favorite, is Taking Off, and the worst track is Us or Them. It might be one of my least favorite Cure songs.
Yeah, my favorite track is Want. My least favorite track is the 13th. So,
all right, we're moving on to number 11 now. And I chose your least favorite Cure album, The Top.
I chose 413 Dream.
Aye. The Top is one of those weird moments in The Cure's discography for me, like contextually and musically. When Pornography came out, it initially didn't do well critically, and The Cure kind of changed up their sound a bit with The Love Cats being a successful single for them. Also, Robert Smith was very prolific at this time, producing and writing the majority of the material on The Top, as well as being in Susie and the Banshees for a little while. So, all of that kind of affected what came out on The Top, which, as a whole, it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. When I was first getting into The Cure, I actually didn't really mind The Top that much. I certainly didn't love it, but I didn't think it was a bad album or anything, but when revisiting it, I just can't really take much away from it. Not that the album is bad as a whole, but I just kind of feel like what the band wanted to do on here just doesn't stick the landing. There's no way around it. I think that this is a bit of a transitional album for The Cure. It's kind of leaning into more accessible new wave-esque territories while also kind of sticking with some neo-psych goth rock elements that define them as a band. They're also kind of throwing in some non-conventional ideas and weird sounds there as well, which are, questionable of quality, to say the least. The only song in this album that I really thought was enjoyable was the title track, but outside of that, the Top's track list is very hit or miss, with a lot of songs just trying to go somewhere interesting, but end up becoming a bit blasé and really bland. I think what they try to do does end up working on later material in their discography, but on The Top, it's just not that good to me or memorable. Also, with it mostly being written by Robert Smith and composed by him, it kind of feels like a Robert Smith solo album that never really happened. Also, as a side note, Banana Fishbones and Give Me are probably some of the worst tracks The Cure have ever made. Those tracks are just fucking deplorable. I hate them. Yeah, all in all, I appreciate The Top as a kind of transitional moment for The Cure, and I don't think it's the worst Cure album, obviously, but it kind of feels like one of the band's more lackluster records, to say the least.
I went with The Cure's most recent album as of recording this episode. Please, Robert Smith, please, drop.
Please, Robert Smith.
Please.
Please.
Which, it's 15 years at this point, so it's not really that recent. And it's also nowhere near as uninteresting as Wild Mood Swings. It's nowhere near as much of a mess as The Top, but it's just the very epitome of mid. There's some highlights. Namely, again, the opening track, which is brilliant. But overall, it sounds like an album made by a band that's still capable, but just slowly running out of steam. It sounds like The Cure, all right. It feels like The Cure. It is The Cure, we all know. But it sounds so, not forced, but like by the numbers. It sounds so predictable. It doesn't really deviate from the beaten path. It just really comes off as lacking any real passion, any creative spark, any real thunder or lightning. And that's not to say that it isn't in any way enjoyable, because it is. It sounds fine. It sounds objectively pleasant and nice to listen to. But it just is so surface level that it's really impossible to rate it any higher than I do. But yeah, I don't want to waste too much time talking about an album that I don't have that much to say. It's Pleasant by The Numbers Cure. Not bad, but yeah, not a highlight in any way.
Yep. My favorite tracks from The Top are The Top and Dressing Up. My least favorite track is Banana Fishbones. Fuck that song.
My favorite track is Underneath the Stars and The Reasons Why, and my least favorite track is Freak Show.
We're moving on to the top 10 now, and my number 10 pick is 413 Dream.
My number 10 pick is Three Imaginary Boys.
Alright, so 413 Dream, as of recording, is the most recent album that The Cure has released. It came out in October of 2008, so it's been almost 15 years since we got a new album by The Cure. You know, Songs of a Lost World has been teased to death for a couple of years, so that may change soon. But for now, this is what it is. And 413 Dream is another one of the band's later year albums that doesn't really stand out. And like you said, it's fairly surface level by The Numbers Cure. It's not really setting out any other huge stylistic shifts or anything like that for The Cure. And while there's a really great opener on the album, the rest leaves a lot to be desired in my opinion. It's mostly just an uninspired and dull album in my opinion. Not bad by any means, but it's just not really doing much for me outside of that great opener. It's fairly forgettable as a whole. The production, the songwriting, the instrumentals, it's all just fine. Not really trying to do anything more, anything less with them. It's just The Cure doing what The Cure does, but for the most part, it's fairly dull. You know, it stays focused on their more gothic-tinged alt-rock sound they toyed with before, but not with as much that's really interesting or refreshing. It's just kind of staying in its lane, and that's fine. It just kind of feels like a pointless album, in my opinion. And, yeah, that's about it.
I went with the band's debut, Three Imaginary Boys.
Ooh.
An album that, again, is not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a far cry from what the band would go on to become. I think it's very much a product of its time, with comparisons to bands like Joy Division and even Wire not being far-fetched in the slightest, but what it really lacks for me is that iconic gothic atmosphere that is now so synonymous with The Cure. Of course, the band were only finding their feet here, and for that reason, and because of a few brilliant moments, this album is still something I would consider a must hear in their discography. It is an important album to the overall history of The Cure. But having heard some of their finest albums and coming back to Three Imaginary Boys is just a bit jarring. The music here is very raw. It's very rhythmic. There's little to no atmosphere to be found. And any atmosphere that is found is just cold, but not in sort of the emotional kind of airy, melancholic way that the future Cure albums are cold, but it's just kind of mechanical and emotionless in its atmosphere, which again isn't always a bad thing, and on tracks like 10:15 Saturday Nights is actually quite fitting and well done, but there's just a lot of tracks here that are so bare bones, so uninteresting instrumentally, and it just really doesn't do anything for me. And again, it's an album that I can't help but compare to later Cure releases, which just doesn't do it any favors, if I'm being honest. I will say though that the bass work is quite good throughout, and as a lot of these tracks are very bare bones and bass driven, you'd hope that is the case. But yeah, I really do enjoy a lot of the bass work, and it's one of the more interesting bass driven albums I've heard. But overall, this album just kind of feels like a gazelle taking her first steps. It's nice to see, but far from graceful.
Yeah. And with that in mind, my favorite track from 413 Dream is Underneath the Stars. Worst track is The Scream.
My favorite tracks are 10:15 Saturday Night and It's Not You. My least favorite tracks are Foxy Lady and Meat Hook.
Alright, moving on to our number 9 picks, and I chose Three Imaginary Boys.
I chose The Cure.
All right.
Same
We all got the
bottom.
same
What was it?
albums
One,
all
two,
out of the
three.
way.
Yeah, same bottom five, different orders.
Very interesting. Yeah, The Cure's debut is one of those debuts that just kind of gets rendered as insignificant in the band's discography because of what they would go on to do after that. It's not a bad album by any means, but for me at least it feels kind of lackluster and sloppy. I mean, it's forgivable considering that it's the band's debut, but I digress. The Cure at this moment in time were making post-punk and jangly new wave tunes, and while there's some diamonds in the rough, a lot of the tunes in this album just kind of feel kind of amateurish and at points a bit sluggish too. I mean, obviously I wouldn't expect a band to hit the nail on the head with their first album, but Three Imaginary Boys feels especially underwhelming, and a lot of things contribute to that for me. For one, the production is pretty mediocre for me. I will say, this is probably one of the rawest sounding Cure albums, but none of it really sounds all that great to me. It feels kind of unrefined, kind of flat, and a bit lifeless. And it doesn't really lend itself well to the more slow-paced and very bog standard tracks here either. Instead, it makes them kind of sound boring, in my opinion. Secondly, the instrumentation and the songwriting, not bad by any means. At points, pretty good, but fairly amateurish, kind of bog standard, I guess. There's some good moments here and there, but it sounds like the band didn't really have much of a direction in mind, and they just kind of wrote some of these songs for the sake of it. They're basically kind of finding their footing, and you can hear that clearly, but the result is a lot of the tracks kind of sounding really boilerplate and kind of uninteresting, bar a few good tracks. And finally, I don't think Robert Smith's vocals are quite as good as they would become. It doesn't help that the vocal mix is really dry, but it just feels like he doesn't have that magic that makes Robert Smith a great vocalist. Even despite my criticisms, there are some really good tracks in this album, particularly the ones that are more energetic, but a lot of the album doesn't really do much for me. Also, a side note, I don't really appreciate the jump scare in Subway Song at all. Thanks for scaring the fucking shit out of me, you fucking cunts. So, yeah, that's all I have to say for Three Imaginary Boys. It's an alright album on its own. Kind of confused as to why it has such a high rating on ROM, but I digress. Not their worst, but it's also just not their best.
I went with The Cure, an album, my opinions of which are quite similar to their most recent album, in that it sounds like The Cure. It sure does. It has a lot of, it checks a lot of the Cure boxes. It has a lot of what you might want in a Cure album, might enjoy in a Cure album. But it's probably the most safe and agreeable album in their entire discography. It's consistently solid. It's consistently enjoyable. It does kind of scratch that Cure itch, but it's again very, very safe, very agreeable, very predictable, and it just, that late point in their career felt like they were really taking no risks. And while it didn't really result in any awful albums, it did result in a lot of just very, very predictable, very by the numbers albums. And The Cure is just another one of those. It's not getting any bonus points for uniqueness, interesting ideas. It's the kind of album you listen to when binging their discography and go, yeah, this sounds fine, I'm enjoying it, and then never have the urge to go back to it and listen to it again. I do recommend giving it a solitary listen if you're a fan of The Cure, but for most most people, I think it's safe to say that it'll just come in through one ear, come straight out the other, and it won't stand out in any meaningful way, because it definitely didn't for me.
Alright. And with that, best tracks off of Three Imaginary Boys are Grinding Halt, Object, and the title track. Least favourite track is Meat Hook.
My favourite tracks are Lost, The End of the World, and Us or Them. And my least favourite track is I Don't Know What's Going On.
Me neither. Anyways, moving on to our number 8 picks. I chose Blood Flowers.
I chose 17 Seconds.
Alright. Blood Flowers is for sure the band's best post Golden Era album for me, and while it doesn't exactly do much to reinvent or even totally reinvigorate the band, it's still a pretty decent attempt at recapturing the magic that made The Cure who they are as a band. There's usually two camps of people when it comes to this album. One of them being people who believe that Blood Flowers is pretty underrated and deserves its flowers after the very disappointing Wild Mood Swings, and others believe it to be an album that was transparently trying too hard to recapture the band's magic half-heartedly. I'm somewhat in the middle of this pack, really, as there is some really enjoyable material on here, but I wouldn't go as far as to say it stands out with the rest of the band's work in context, and does kind of try and recapture specifically like Disintegration era The Cure. Bloodflower sonically feels like it's trying to take an approach in terms of production and songcraft that's similar in vein to the aforementioned Disintegration, but this time it has more flashy guitar work at points. There's influences that kind of feel down-tempo inspired, and there's even longer song lengths at points. Sometimes The Cure do it incredibly well, like on the 11-minute Watching Me Fall, the title track, and The Last Day of Summer, and at its low points it just fails to stand out to me and comes off like a little bit bland or redundant. But unlike a lot of the lower points in The Cure's discography, I can't say that there's a particular song on this album that's bad. At the very least, it's alright and doesn't really tread the waters past that point. It's produced fairly well, the instrumentals are performed well, Robert Smith sounds good on here, I like a lot of the guitar work, and at its best, it's pretty damn enjoyable. But for the most part, it just feels like one of their kind of middling albums, kind of it's in the middle in their discography, and just doesn't really, breach beyond that point, I guess. And that's all I have to say for Bloodflowers.
I went with 17 Seconds, which this album really is a massive leap in the right direction after the band's, in my opinion, lackluster debut. The soundscapes of this album are immediately recognizable as The Cure. It's still very much cold, anxious, and bass-driven like their debut, but it finally, I think, gets one thing right, and that's atmosphere. This thing is so hypnotic and dark in its soundscapes, and it perfectly establishes that morose and melancholy atmosphere that The Cure are so well known for. This is also the band's first album to explore a more gothic rock sound, and that's a genre that the band obviously would go on to become the face of, so obviously can't complain about that. And they, I think, get it right on the first go when it comes to this more atmospheric gothic style, because tracks like Secrets and In Your House are absolutely hidden gems, and of course The Forest is still one of the band's greatest achievements ever, period. I do think, however, that a lot of the deep cuts are a little forgettable, but I think this project is certainly more in line with the best of the best that The Cure has to offer. It's the first album that I think that we're talking about that I'm going to give a 7 and above, so we're now in the range where these albums are ones that I very, very much enjoy. And 17 Seconds not only ushered in kind of a new era of The Cure, but it's also ushering a new era of the worst to best here, because we're going to be talking about the albums I really, really want to talk about now. The best of the best.
We're getting there soon for me, don't worry. Best tracks on Bloodflowers were Watching Me Fall, The Last Day of Summer, and the title track. Worst track is 39.
My favourite tracks on 17 Seconds are Secrets, In Your House, and A Forest. My least favorite track is 3.
Alright, and now we're moving on to the number 7 picks, and wouldn't you know, mine is 17 Seconds.
Mine is Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me.
Ooh, that low, wow. Okay then.
Yeah.
Okay, where is it on the notes? There we are. 17 Seconds. It's funny thinking about 17 Seconds in the context of The Cure's discography, as it's their sophomore album, but for me it kind of feels like the first proper Cure album. I mean, Three Imaginary Boys didn't really showcase much of what made The Cure who they are at that point. It only really began to happen with 17 Seconds, as this is where elements that define The Cure sonically in their post-punk era really took shape. 17 Seconds was where the gloomy, gothic aesthetics and atmospherics really began to bleed into The Cure's music. The sound palette that was explored in this album was dark, gloomy, and spacious. That combined with lots of post-punk instrumentation, and in turn The Cure really hit upon a sound that they could make their own, which they began to do in this very album. In terms of quality, there's definitely better Cure albums in my opinion, but there's no denying that some of the material on this album is some of the most essential in The Cure's discography. Forest, for example, which is honestly one of the single greatest post-punk tracks ever made. honestly, it's flawless. The production was a massive step up for The Cure as it sounded more refined, layered, and muscular when compared to the debut. The more atmospheric production gives way to more interesting sound palettes. The guitar tone is fantastic. Generally, everything just sounds really balanced and well crafted. Instrumentally, it's very good. It's post-punk to The Cure. The drumming, the guitar work, the bass work, it's all fantastic across this thing. And there's just fantastic moments, like I mentioned. I don't know what happened there. I suppose my main gripe with 17 Seconds is that it kind of paces itself a bit too slow at points. I totally understand with the direction that the band were taking with this sound, but the very slow burning tracks do feel like that, a slow burn. And those kind of slow burning post-punk tracks are kind of indistinguishable from one another for me. They're good, don't get me wrong, but I honestly couldn't tell you which ones were which outside of the absolutely amazing tracks in this album, like Of Force and like Play for Today. So yeah, that's all I have to say. 17 Seconds is a good album for The Cure. It's a step in the right direction for the band going forward, but it wouldn't be one of my favourite albums of theirs.
The band's 7th album, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, sounds like the result of the band properly realizing the more psychedelic and eclectic direction of the top. The quality of a lot of the tracks on here completely towers over everything that was present on the top without breaking a sweat. And it's also far more consistent while also being well over an hour long, so it beats out that album in basically every department. That being said, when compared to the rest of the band's material, I don't think this album is quite there with their best, but I will start with the positives first. This thing is, as I said, very eclectic. It's got a post-punky alt-rock core, but it explores a variety of soundscapes and genres, from the familiar sounds of gothic rock and new wave to pop, neo-psychedelia. This thing covers a lot of ground stylistically in its 75 minutes, and most of what it attempts, it nails the landing, and it does very well. Tracks like How Beautiful You Are and One More Time are understated highlights, and obviously Just Like Heaven is a classic. So needless to say, you're in for a treat with a lot of the tracks on this album. However, I do think that it has some flaws. In my eyes, it is too long. It has plenty of great material throughout, so it never becomes an absolute chore to listen to. But I can't help but feel like this thing would have been so much better if they trimmed about 5 or so tracks off this thing, even bringing it down to 50 minutes. I do think a lot of the deep cuts just don't live up to those big highlights, and it doesn't really justify 75 minutes for me. But I still think that for the most part it's very solid. There are some weaker tracks, but with almost 20 tracks, there's something for everyone here, and there's also no shortage of just great moments. So it's still a fine album, and it doesn't bring it down too much. But that's my one big flaw with it.
Alright. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks on 17 Seconds were Play for Today, A Forest, and At Night. My least favourite track is 3.
My favourite tracks are The Kiss, Just Like Heaven, and One More Time. My least favourite tracks are Hey You, ! And Hot Hot Hot, !
Enough exclamation marks, huh?
Nah.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 6 picks, and I chose Wish.
I chose Faith.
Alright then. It's a bit of a huge task to follow up an album that was as big and as acclaimed as Disintegration was. Plus, with The Cure releasing new music in a new decade where things have already drastically changed, to say the least, it would have been interesting to see what the results were like at the time, but from a music and album point of view, Wish is a pretty good follow-up, and it's a pretty good album on its own, but for me it's nowhere near The Cure's best. Sonically, The Cure do step away from their more slow and incredibly atmospheric and emotional strains and focus more on a somewhat alternative rock sound that's tinged with The Cure's main characteristics. It's not void of atmosphere, with that being said, and I can't say there's a bad song in here at all. In fact, it's all, at the very least, pretty solid, and it does have some fantastic tracks that stand out in one way or another. Plus, big bonus for them creating one of their biggest hits here with Friday I'm in Love. I think Robert Smith shows some really strong songwriting on this album. There's some really good instrumentation as well, the production is good, and it's all in all a really good album that has some fantastic songs, but in the context of The Cure's discography, I just don't think I'll return to it over a bunch of the band's other albums. There's a kind of monotony that I feel when listening to this album at points, not to the point where it ruins the album, but I felt it on this album more than some of the other albums that The Cure made, especially in their golden era. Plus, when I sat down to write notes about this album, I was kind of struggling to come up with anything else to say about it aside from this. It's very good. It does have a lot of really good tracks, and like I said, production, songwriting, all that, very good. But I just don't think it's a completely standout album for The Cure. And honestly, your criticism for Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me for it being too long, I also kind of think Wish is a little too long, personally. And some of the deep cuts just don't really hit as much. But with that being said, a lot of it is still pretty good. And yeah, with that in mind, I don't have much else to say about Wish. It's just pretty good all around.
I went with Fate, an album that is very similar stylistically to its predecessor, 17 Seconds. It's bass-driven, it's rhythmic, and most of all, very atmospheric. But I think the atmosphere between those two albums is the biggest difference maker. 17 Seconds was quite gloomy and morose, but Faith is just so... It elevates those to the extreme. It sounds so cold, so empty, so dark. It really stands out from anything the band had released before and also since. It sounds kind of stylistically like The Cure's equivalent to Joy Division's Closer. The compositions here are super spacious, just filled with so much emptiness, very slow burning and minimalist throughout. And it just all adds to the overwhelming sea of bleakness that the music floats in. But bleakness that is haunting rather than dull. I wouldn't say it's the band's magnum opus, but it sure is a standout in their discography, and it's, in my opinion, the best of their early pre-pornography discography. That
bro
wasn't
spitting
meant to
bars.
rhyme.
Bro spitting bars.
Yeah.
Nice one.
Yeah, but I think it's probably the first album here that is an 8 or above for me. It's a brilliant album, and The Funeral Party is simply peak music and a top 10 track in their discography for me, without a doubt.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost at the 8s. And yeah, that in mind, my favorite tracks from Wish are From the Edge of the Deep Green Sea, Friday I'm in Love, and To Wish Impossible Things. My least favorite track is End.
My favorite tracks on Faith are Other Voices, The Funeral Party, and Doubt, and I do not have any least favorite tracks.
And we're moving into the top 5. And with that in mind, my number 5 pick is Faith.
My number 5 pick is Blood Flowers.
Wow, that's really high. Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
Alright then, I'll let you explain yourself in a minute. Anyways, Faith is another one of the band's kind of earlier gloomy post-punk records, and for me, it shares a lot of the sonic similarities with the album that came before it, with that one being 17 Seconds. But for me at least, Faith is a major improvement on what the band were doing on that previous album, and if you were going chronologically, I personally think this is the first great album The Cure ever made. Like I said, Faith is in that same sonic space that 17 Seconds was in, that being their cold, atmospheric, and gothic style traditional post-punk, but where 17 Seconds was a bit too slow burning, Faith feels a bit more fleshed out and engaging, especially in its more kind of slow burning tracks. There isn't too much of a difference with what's going on in the production and the instrumentation as well as the core ideas, but it feels like The Cure are trying to play to their strengths and take further steps towards something greater, which they did, and even then, Faith has a lot of really great tracks to its name. The majority of the album takes on the slow-burning ideas that are designed to soak you into the atmosphere, which I think are done so well. There's once again great post-punk instrumentation, plenty of great drumming, bass work, and guitar work. The bass work especially is fantastic. The atmospherics are starting to sound a lot more ethereal, and they sound a bit bigger in comparison with 17 Seconds. Take All Cats Are Grey and the incredible Funeral Party, for example. Robert Smith's vocals and the songwriting is great once again as well, and for me, I think The Cure's exploration of what they previously done paid off with this album. Excuse me. I mentioned All Cats Are Grey in the Funeral Party, but the latter is honestly one of my favorite tracks from The Cure. I also love the energy of Primary and Doubt, and the rest of the album is at the very least good. A couple of tracks may blend in, but they're still very enjoyable. Short album again, but it's still very good. And of course, from here, it would only get better for The Cure quality-wise. This was a step in the right direction, and in its own right, it's a great album. In fact, the first great Cure album in their discography, if you're going chronologically. Yeah, Faith is great. It's a fantastic gothic rock and post-punk record. It's definitely one of the best they made in their pure post-punk era, and I enjoy it a lot. I think that it's fantastic. Hence why it's the number 5 spot.
I went with Blood Flowers. I did mention before the band's late career drop off. There is a little bit of an asterisk beside that term for me, because in between two completely unnoteworthy albums, the band released what is, in my opinion, a bit of a hidden gem in the form of Blood Flowers. And let's be honest, what you said earlier about it is true. This is the band trying to recapture the magic of Disintegration. I'd even go as far as to say it's blatant. But you know what? If it even managed to capture a fraction of the album's magic, we would still have something good on our hands. And it definitely does for me. It doesn't entirely drop the alternative rock stylings that they had kind of grown so comfortable within over the previous decade. But it's, for the first time since Disintegration, it's fully embracing gothic rock and dream pop yet again, and the results are actually quite enjoyable. It is The Cure absolutely playing to their strengths. They're not really experimenting, but I think after stepping back from this sound for quite a while, they were able to go back into it with a fresh perspective, a hunger and a drive. And that makes, I think, for quite an interesting and quite an emotive and passionate release. It does also try to kind of weave in cool, like, unique things into the mix. There are things that definitely make it stand out from Disintegration. It's not just Control C, Control V. But you know, it's The Cure that I know and love, making an album in the genre and the style which I most prefer them in. So yeah, I'm sometimes I'm easy to please, and this is definitely one of those times. I think the highlights here are honestly somewhere among The Cure's best tracks. And it's far superior than the album that came just before it, or the album that came just after it. And in a way, as of now at least, it does kind of feel like a last hurrah for the band, like their last great album in a genre that we all know and love them for. And yeah, I think it has some incredible moments, and I think it's a very, very great album.
Debatable. Anyways, my favorite tracks off of Faith are Primary, All Cats Are Grey, and The Funeral Party. God, Funeral Party is so fucking good. Mm-hmm. And my least favorite track is The Drowning Man.
My favorite tracks are Out of This World, Maybe Someday, and The Loudest Sound. My least favorite track is There Is No If.
Alright, and we're moving on to our number 4 picks. I chose Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me.
I chose The Head on the Door.
Damba. Anyways, being another one of the best offerings that the band made in the 80s, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me features nothing that you wouldn't expect to hear from The Cure, which isn't a dig or a bad thing at all, since the album itself is just pure quality, and at points a big step towards the album that would follow it. You know, more on that later, but I think that Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me is great. It's another great effort from The Cure, and it also happens to contain some of the band's best songs and hits for me. For me, I think the album is very much like the two albums that came out before it, which were heavily tied to the new wavy, neo-psychedelic pop rock and post-punk sound they were very much in at the time, and as well as that, it also remains as eclectic as those other records, and its eclecticism and its staying power really do act as its key strengths, in my opinion. Even then, the majority of this album is just fantastic and has some pure quality to its name. In every aspect, production-wise, vocally, songwriting, and so on, it stays consistently good, and it's fantastic, and at its very best, it's amazing. The more energetic and catchy moments blend incredibly well with its more atmospheric tracks, and it's hard to deny that what Robert Smith and co did on here was nothing short of impressive, given how good it sounds and how many fantastic tracks are on here. And some of those fantastic tracks are some of The Cure's biggest and best tracks, like Why Can't I Be With You and Just Like Heaven, the latter especially. It's literally one of their biggest songs ever. I really like a lot of the deep cuts in this album as well. The guitar work, the bass work is fantastic. Once again, I adore Robert Smith's vocals, and the overarching themes of love and romance in the lyrics are written incredibly well and really do match whatever vibe each of those tracks takes on. Sometimes even adding to the greatness of some of those songs for me. I wish I could have put it higher in the list, honestly, because I do well and truly think this album is great. There was one album where they were able to do the sound a bit better and a bit more consistent on, and for me, I think the length of this album really does hinder some of the replay value. I will agree with you there, as there are some deep cuts that I probably won't come back to, and maybe as the full album I won't come back to it, admittedly. Even then, this is still great. I think it's fantastic. So many fantastic moments on here. A lot of tracks I do really love. A lot of great ideas. A lot of great songwriting. And it's just The Cure being The Cure and doing it very fucking well, might I add.
I went with The Head on a Door, which was a step in a more alternative rock and bright direction for the band, replacing a lot of the unsettling tension present on Pornography and previous albums, with very lush synth and guitar work and rather warm atmospheres present throughout. The goth tendencies aren't thrown out the window here, not at all. But everything about this album just feels a lot more joyous, more playful than anything the band had released prior. And to me, it's almost The Cure at their most feel-good. Tracks like Push and Night Like This are absolutely gorgeous, yet also tastefully radio-friendly. And In Between Days is one of the band's first ever tracks that I would consider a smash hit. It's absolutely life-affirming, it's beautiful, yet undeniably catchy, and it's an alternative rock classic in every sense of the word. And I think that the top, I hate to mention it again, but it definitely hinted that the band were interested in a little bit more than just making very melancholic and dark and brooding anthems. And The Head on the Door is an album that finally realized this desire without sacrificing any of the magic of The Cure in the process. I will say, just like The Top, which is a completely inferior album, and they're not comparable in any capacity, but just like The Top,
we know.
There are some moments here that seem completely half-baked, even though they are far more scarce than anything on The Top and albums near the bottom of the ranking. But, I mean, it's still got so many highlights that tracks like Screw, which are fucking horrific, really are just few and far in between, and don't even leave much of a stain on the album's legacy, in my opinion.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks on Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me are The Kiss, Why Can't I Be With You, and Just Like Heaven. Worst track is Fight.
My favourite tracks are In Between Days, Push, and A Night Like This. My least favourite track is Screw.
And now we're in the top three.
Mm-hmm.
And with that in mind, my number 3 pick is Pornography.
My number 3 pick is also Pornography.
Oh my god, how could you do this?
This is the first time we've agreed, actually.
Yeah, nice. Yes, Pornography. Not the one you're thinking about, you fucking dirty yoke, yeah.
Yeah, fucking
we're on
the gutter.
Get your mind out the gutter, you filthy beggar. Yeah, we're on about the Cure album, which coincidentally also fucks, and is absolutely one of the Cure's best albums ever. It's easily the best of their very early post-punk era, and as far as gothic rock goes, this album is probably one of the best examples of it being done incredibly well and consistently well. In a lot of ways, what the Cure were doing before this album was basically building up to this very album. Each album saw the band grasp and expand on ideas which would then be carried over onto Pornography, but in contrast, this album captures the more nightmarish and morbid nature of what gothic rock has to offer, and in many ways it's just phenomenal, and it's understandable as to why it's one of their most seminal albums. You know, Pornography is far and away the darkest album the Cure have ever made, both sonically and lyrically. Now, Robert Smith has always had interesting songwriting, but this album is just fucking bleak, nihilistic, and morbid, and that suits what's happening sonically because this album sounds, well, bleak and morbid. The production across Pornography is really dense and layered. It's laced with tons of effects and manipulations, and they make use of them to their best, since this album just sounds fantastic. It's tonally dark yet produced so well, and for me, it's definitely up there as one of the best produced albums that The Cure have in their discography. It is hypnotic. Instrumentally, this album is fantastic as well. The post-punk instrumentals are great. There's lots of great songwriting moments, lots of great bass and guitar work. The more rhythmic and kind of tribal-esque drumming that takes over this album gives it a bit of flair. The synth tones in this album are varied and great sounding. The general instrumentation blends incredibly well with the sound the band were going for. Plus, the songcraft can't go understated as well. It is fantastic. I think some of my favorite material that The Cure have ever made is on this album too. Cold, especially in my opinion, is just something else, and each song is at the very least great in my opinion. So they kind of play to their own individual strengths, each member of the band does, and coincide to make something that's all in a harrowing that's all in all a harrowing experience, and it's one of The Cure's greatest expressions ever. And with that in mind, yeah, this album is just brilliant. I obviously wouldn't consider it my favorite album by The Cure, but Pornography really stands out on its own as one of the best Cure albums. It's really unique, it's dark, it's just probably one of the most morbid albums of the 80s, especially in this genre, and yeah, it's fantastic. What more can I say?
I agree.
Yeah!
Pornography was certainly not the first great album from the band, but in my eyes, it is their first, bona fide classic must hear. Just one of the albums of all time type beat.
Type beat, okay.
It fully dives into the gothic rock sound that the band would go on to define, turning things down slightly on the bass driven and cold approach of their previous records, and kind of completely ditching the minimalism of past records to fully embrace a texture and density in its craft and its ever so somber atmospheres. The opening track, the iconic 100 Years, is an immediate statement of intent, with Robert Smith's signature anxious vocals and morose lyrics being driven by an ominous and nocturnal spiral of dark yet hypnotically psychedelic distortion and synth work. And this track kind of acts as a recipe for success for the rest of the album. It still does showcase some of that minimal bass driven some of those minimal bass driven moments and tracks like Siamese Dream and A Strange Day, but even those don't quite deliver the same punch as tracks off their previous record did, and instead focus more on using that minimalism to craft very lonely and desolate atmospheres. Then there's tracks like The Hanging Garden and Pornography, where the drums with their very ominous patterns act almost like the lead instrument, and the guitars fill in the gaps between them. The vocals are used to create this unique and suspenseful soundscape, and it all just comes together to create something unlike anything the band had made previous. And really, as I said, it ushered in kind of a new era of creativity, of texture, and of just grandiosity for The Cure. I think that this album is just such a massive leap for the band in their quest to become one of the most interesting and important bands of the 80s. And to this day, it's still an absolute undeniable highlight in their career. It's a brilliant album. Fuck yeah.
Fuck yeah, man. Excuse me. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Pornography are 100 Years, The Hanging Garden, and Cold. My least favourite track is A Short-Term Effect.
My favourite tracks are 100 Years, The Hanging Garden, and Cold, and my least favourite tracks don't exist.
Of course. And with that in mind, we're moving on to our number 2 picks. And for me, my second favourite Cure album is Disintegrate. No, it's The Head in the Door. It's The Head in the Door.
Okay, fuck. Alright. My
I
number
was going to throw a fucking curveball, didn't you?
My number 2 is Wish.
That was very surprising for me, actually. I know you rated it highly. I've seen the fucking score on RYM, but damn.
Yeah.
And The Head in the Door. When I was first getting into The Cure, I decided to give a couple of their albums a go, of course. Disintegration was the actual first album I've heard from The Cure, but the other album that I heard from them very early on was actually The Head in the Door, which was recommended to me by someone from the Mike the Snare Discord server. I can't remember who exactly, but shout out to them anyway. Which is an album that has stuck with me ever since I first heard it, and since that first time hearing it, it's remained as one of my favorite albums that The Cure has made, and I hold it near and dear. I mean, the album itself is just a blast for me to listen to. It's another one of The Cure's masterclasses in making nothing but worthwhile and incredibly catchy tunes. The album has some of my favorite Cure songs, and as an album, I think I've come back to the full thing a lot more than many whenever I'm in the mood for The Cure. You know, The Head in the Door for me is some of the best work that The Cure made during their prime, especially in their more pop rock new wave era. It's in that sonic vein of what the band were trying to do on the top, but rather than it being an album that is pretty fucking horrid or doesn't really do anything interesting, The Head in the Door is the exact opposite. An exciting, catchy, successfully diverse album that feels fun and thrilling to listen to from front to back. Production-wise, it's fantastic. Vocally, Robert Smith sounds fantastic and delivers on one of his best performances, in my opinion. I think the album is very consistent for what it tries to be, and with each track being vastly different from one another, it leaves so much room for expansion, and it's exciting. I don't think we talk about sequencing enough in regards to albums, but the way this album flows just feels outstanding, in my opinion. To make things better for me, every single song of this album is at the very least good, and at its peaks, it's amazing. Some of my favourite songs that The Cure have made appear in this album, In Between Days, Push, and Sinking, just to name a few. The first of those three might just be a contender for my favourite Cure song, to be honest. I played it on one of our streams before. I love it so much. The experimentation and quirkiness of the album combined with that energy and catchiness makes the album dynamic and exciting to listen to from front to back, and I just can't help but love this album every single time I listen to it. For those reasons alone, it's one of the best albums in The Cure's discography for me, and it's one that I cherish a lot. All in all, I love this album. I think it's one of the best Cure albums, and it pains me to put it at number 2, but I mean, what we have at number 1 is, yeah.
Yeah. I went with Wish. Here it is, the nostalgia hot take of the day. We're back.
Ugh.
We're back.
Ugh. Why can't we agree on anything? Fuck.
Wish is my second favorite Cure album of all time. I think that this album takes the Cure's sound back a few years to their alternative rock stylings and adding a bit of a 90s flair to their first album in that decade. And there's also hints of like twee pop, jangle pop, neo psychedelia, and even baggy on the track Cut. To really like seal the 90s package on this thing. And I think the sound of this album is super easy to listen to and digest. As while it definitely does new things for the band's sound, it all is very alternative rock, very pop rock centric, which is also no surprise why it's so commercially successful even to this day. But almost everything this album does just checks all the boxes for me. It's tasteful in all the influences it lends from contemporary artists. It never sacrifices that iconic Cure sound for something more trendy, and it's consistently providing some of the best songwriting, some of the most memorable soundscapes, and some of the band's honestly most beautiful moments. It presents just a whole spectrum of aesthetics, from dark gloominess on tracks like Apart to just the joyous and just life-affirming Friday I'm in Love. Then there's the, as I said, bouncy Manchester inspired Cut. It really does present so much in its hour-long track list and adds so much iconic highlights to the Cure discography of so many different varying styles. And I just think it's one of those albums that tries so much and tries to kind of dip its toe into anything it can, and somehow it succeeds overwhelmingly time and time again in anything it attempts. And despite it being quite accessible, I think it sacrifices absolutely nothing in terms of quality, in terms of emotion, in terms of atmosphere. It's just an album that I come back to more often than a lot of Cure albums, just like you do with Head on the Door. And it's an album that the singles from which just rank very, very highly in my favorite Cure songs of all time. It really is it's not an album for everyone, I'll admit, but for me, it just checks all the boxes effortlessly.
Okay, whatever you say. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Head in the Door are... Hold on, let me see if I can find it again. There we are. In Between Days, Push, and Sinking. My least favorite track is Screw. I will agree with you. Screw is just okay.
Oh, you didn't even say it's bad. Screw is fucking okay. My favorite tracks on Wish are From the Edge of the Deep Green Sea, Friday I'm in Love, and A Letter to Elise. My least favorite track is Wendy Time.
Alright, and we're moving on to our number one spot, and if you haven't really guessed already, lads, it's actually The Top.
What?
Nah, Disintegration.
Oh, I forgot about I chose the Love Cat single.
The Love Cat single. Okay, fair enough.
No, Disintegration.
Disintegration. So yeah, Disintegration. I mean, what other album was going to be number one on this list? Disintegration was the first album I ever listened to when I was getting into The Cure. It was just mesmerizing to listen to on that very first listen, and as the years have gone by, and after listening to it a decent amount, it's still just as mesmerizing since that first listen. Better yet, to this day, The Cure's Disintegration is up there as one of my favorites, one of my all-time favorites even. And for good reason. This album is just a masterpiece and is really the moment where The Cure defines gothic rock and defines some of the best music that you could hear from the 80s. Disintegration is what the stretch of albums before it was building up to. It more or less combines the moods and sounds and ideas that those previous albums contained, but now it's packaged into an album that is just a masterclass. That is an otherworldly experience, to say the least. It displays everything that you love about The Cure down to a T. Hell, I'd even go as far as to say that it's the quintessential album by The Cure, because it's not only that amazing, it also does what The Cure do best. It's fantastic, from the lyrics to the production, the instrumentation, the songcraft, the songwriting, basically everything. For me, I think Disintegration is the best produced album The Cure has made. The atmospheres, the potency, the textures, they all just hit different on this album, only kind of further elevating what each individual song is trying to do. Each individual song feels perfected in that regard, and the atmosphere is just immaculate. It's dark, it's beautiful, it's dreamlike, and it's nostalgic sounding, and it's hard to get enough of this because it's just that incredible to my ears. Instrumentally, this album is just fantastic as well. There's plenty of brilliant guitar work, drumming, synth work, and bass work on this album. Fascination Street has one of my favorite bass lines ever. These songs are just crafted so well that they work just brilliantly as melancholy and as brilliantly poppy songs. It just goes to show The Cure's knack for that kind of songwriting was just unmatched. You know, so many songs in this album are just some of my favorite songs that The Cure have ever made. Hell, even some are probably the best I've ever heard and remain as some of my all-time favorite songs. It's incredibly consistent. It doesn't drag on for me, and I just get lost in what I'm hearing every single time I turn this album on. It's just the perfect blend of gothic textures and post-punk and kind of poppy songwriting. I love it. So yeah, Disintegration is a masterpiece. It's absolutely one of the best albums of the 80s for me, and to this day it's remained as one of my favorite albums of all time. It's one of these albums that I think will stay with the person since the first time they hear it, and will remain as a timeless piece that should never be forgotten. It's the quintessential Cure album. It has some of my favorite Cure songs ever, and it's just perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details. And I suppose I'll finish it off with a quote from South Park. Robert Smith is the greatest human being that ever lived.
True.
Our savior. That was a quote from Jesus, by the way.
Right, yeah. Controversial opinion. I'm very sorry, Wild Mood Swings fans, but Disintegration is the 7 people in the world. Disintegration is the best Cure album. Yeah, it is. I think it's not only their best album. I also think it's unrivaled in that aspect. Some may disagree. I don't care. But despite the quality that the band consistently brought to the table throughout the 80s, I think Disintegration still manages to just stand above the rest. It's the definition of a masterpiece, and the list of positive terms I could use to describe this project is basically never ending. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's drenched in a beautiful melancholy. Its soundscapes are decade defining. It captures the aura and atmosphere of its era like few other albums. It's produced masterfully and produced in a way that gets the most out of its incredibly lush and ethereal soundscapes. The songwriting throughout is some of, if not Robert Smith's best. His performances are absolutely chilling. The band's performances are absolutely chilling. The instrumentation throughout is just life-affirming. The way the band add just subtle dream pop elements, especially within the guitar effects, to their gothic rock style, it just does absolute wonders to the band's kind of whimsical yet melancholy aesthetic and sound. It's genuinely just the best Cure album, I think, in every single field, every single aspect. There's not a single weak moment in its track listing, from the opening plain songs, gorgeous density, to the closing title track. It's just the Cure at their best, with absolutely no low points, just highlight after highlight after highlight. It's one of the best albums of the 80s and one of the best albums of all time, and I fucking love it. Masterpiece.
Absolutely. You're not going to finish with a quote from South Park? God.
No, I don't memorize South Park quotes.
Come on, you have to at least know the episode
know.
where Robert Smith actually voiced in the show as himself. Yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Disintegration are basically all of them, but if I had to pick, I'd go with Pictures of You, Close Down, and Fascination Street. No least favorites in fucking sight.
Jesus, picking 3 was something else, but I'll go
really
with
was.
Pictures of You, Love Song, and Lullaby.
And with that in mind, that's it for The Cure.
Let's go.
We have ranked their entire discography from worst to best. Let's fucking go. It's about time that we did this. I've been wanting to do this for ages. And, yeah, that was the first worst to best of 2023. How do you feel, my guy?
Good. Cure.
Very good.
Even.
Amazing, even. Quite stupendously good, even. But yeah, so that's going to be it for today's worst to best. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's worst to best. I really hope that you enjoyed. Let us know what your rankings are for The Cure, or what some of your favorite albums or songs are from them, some of your least favorites are, and, generally just leave a comment, just let us know. And, as usual, time to plug the necessary links in the description to our own channels. You should check out Nostalgia's most recent year-end list, which is very good. I didn't do one, unfortunately, because I'm too dead inside. I don't know.
He doesn't believe in years and time. It's just...
Time is a concept.
It's an arbitrary concept that he just doesn't follow.
Of course. Yeah, that's me. That's just me. But yeah, of course, Album of the Year pages and Rate Your Music pages will be in the description as well. And of course, if you want to support us and check out some of the perks that we have, you should definitely check out the Patreon. And if you just want to chat with us someday, join the Discord. There's plenty of great people in there that are music lovers as well. And just feel free. And is there anything else I'm missing? Also, Twitter is there as well, even though we barely use it. Go follow the Twitter as well.
Give us a reason to use it.
Yeah. Also, we live stream a lot, so you should definitely come check out the streams whenever we can. And in between then, we'll have album reactions out as well. I've been slacking like crazy on getting the Dope Throne reaction up, but hopefully I'll get that done soon. And I guess we'll just end it there.
Namaste.
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 Of course, it's been me, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
Gluck.
Peace and love.